discussion because of the fact that the discussion on the GST has now been around with us from 2007, 2008. It's been something which has been debated inside and outside Parliament for a long period of time. It's also true that it's been more than a year since it was first passed by the Lok Sabha, and it was held up because of the fact that the government couldn't get for itself a consensus in the Rajya Sabha. And we also know that it now has to go, and we need separate bills in 29 states, 2 union territories, which will actually establish the GST structure. So it's still not over. But over this period of time, the newspapers periodically have been full of discussions on the issue of the different contentious sort of issues which have come up as a result of the fact that there has been disagreements not merely across political lines or across ideological inclinations, but differences which exist even within people who otherwise similarly thought about economic policy in general and the reform of the fisc, in particular the reform of taxation policy in particular. Now, what I thought I'd do, however, is really look at two things. First, of course, is to look at the argument, which I think is the basis for much of the so-called consensus, that we really have here a tax which constitutes a sort of completely, a historical, remarkable, game-changing transition in terms of the way in which the state mobilizes its resources. And the way the state mobilizes its resources, we know, matters because of the fact of the kind of impact it has in terms of both interstate, regional, and of course, vertical inequalities which exist. Who exactly is going to be finally bearing the burden of this tax to the extent that it becomes an important component of the overall taxation structure. And the second, of course, is to look at the argument that actually this is something which already has reached a stage where we've sort of established some kind of cooperative federalism, that everybody has come to terms with the kind of implications which would have to them in terms of being state governments, because a feature of India's federal or quasi-federal polity has always been that there's been an attempt to try and get to a distribution of taxation powers and spending powers between the center and the states. And we have this remarkable institution, the Finance Commission, which is appointed to decide the actual, the sort of transfer of resources from the center to the states for every 5 years. So therefore, it actually is a situation where even though a lot of the taxation powers rests with the center and a lot of the spending responsibilities rest with the state, the mediation of the Finance Commission, it has been argued, actually allows for the fact that we've been able to maintain a semblance of unity across this federal polity. And therefore, if you say that we've now moved to a higher stage in cooperative federalism, the argument must ostensibly be that this new tax regime, the goods and services tax, is going to be something which is going to, in fact, not challenge that kind of an ability to be able to sustain a federal polity despite this need for distribution of taxing and spending powers, but it is actually going to improve the situation in terms of the degree to which you have cooperation between the states themselves and between the states as a group and the center. Now, as far as the first is concerned, are we really talking about a purely, technically, highly acceptable, efficient tax structure which couldn't be put into place because of the messy nature of Indian politics, or the messy nature of Indian federal politics? Or is it that there are some things which in the course of this kind of hype, in the course of this kind of propaganda, there is something being missed about this tax, about what it actually does? Now, first and foremost, we must realize what we're talking about is an indirect tax. And if we go back to our understanding of tax systems, indirect taxes generally are far more regressive in the sense that they are less redistributive in their character than direct taxes, because direct taxes can be so structured that the rich who earn the surplus incomes pay much more or a much higher proportion of the total taxes mobilized. Whereas in the case of indirect taxes, the only way in which you can get some kind of progressivity, that is, get to a situation where the rich pay more, is to have, let's say, a higher tax on automobiles than you would have on salt, for example. Basically try to distribute taxes across commodities such that commodities which are consumed by lower income groups or the middle income groups are taxed less or not taxed at all, whereas commodities which ostensibly are imposed on the higher income groups are taxed much more. The difficulty of that we've known through history in India is essentially the problem that if you actually try and move the tax structure, the indirect tax structure, that most of your taxes fall on the upper income groups, the extent to which you can mobilize large amounts of revenue from the populace at large reduces. That really the easiest way to get yourself a large amount of indirect taxes is to impose it on mass consumption goods, or you impose it on universal intermediates, like you impose it on oil, or you impose it on commodities which some people think should not be consumed, but in fact is consumed to substantial measure, like alcohol. There are certain sets of commodities where the elasticity or the buoyancy of this tax is much more than if you actually impose it on, let's say, high-end cars like whatever BMWs and Mercedes-Benzes. You can have a very high tax, but the amount of revenue you're going to get at the end of the game is not going to be very much. So therefore, there is a tendency, particularly when governments which are trying to facilitate the private sector want to go lenient on the direct tax front, there's a tendency to try and rely more on indirect taxes, and that we know is something which is regressive. That it reduces the degree to which you're imposing the burden of aggregate taxation on the rich than you would on the less well-to-do, the middle classes, the working people, the poor, etc. So therefore, we need to take this into account. Whatever talk about efficiency, we must recognize the fact that if this is going to become an important instrument of revenue mobilization by the center and the states, where we get a substantial degree of revenue, such that we could predict that you get actually as a result of this transition, something like 1 percentage point or 1.55 percentage point increase in the rate of GDP growth, then obviously you're doing it through a mechanism which by definition has to be a mechanism which is less progressive than would have been a direct tax or a change in the direct taxation structure. But the other feature about this, of course, is the fact that it's argued that the nature of a value-added tax, and for those of you who are from economics would have come across this, the nature of a value-added tax is that it addresses two kinds of problems. One problem it addresses is that a value-added is basically the difference between the value of the output and the value of the inputs which are used to produce that output. And if you look at it in terms of what it contains, it basically contains incomes. It contains the wages, the rent, the interest, and the profits which are earned within the system. That's what constitutes value added. So if you don't impose tax on value added, but you impose tax on the price of the final product, then to the extent that you're taxing many commodities, you're taxing inputs as well as you're taxing final products. So you're taxing sort of basic inputs, intermediates, and final products. What's going to happen is when you impose a tax on an earlier stage good, that good then enters into an input into another commodity, and if you impose a tax on the price of that commodity, you have two kinds of things which happen. Firstly, you are taxing the input multiple times. So you have what everybody describes, as you must have read, the cascading effect associated with the normal sales tax, excise duty, whatever it may be. And secondly, of course, since the price of the commodity, when it's finally paid by the consumer at each stage, or the buyer at each stage, because intermediates don't reach the final consumer, the price which you pay, which is paid by the buyer at each stage, includes the tax which had been paid in previous stages. So you're not merely taxing inputs and intermediates multiple times, you're also imposing a tax on tax because of the fact that the previous tax gets included in the price in the intermediate and in the final product, and if you impose a tax on the price, you're going to get this kind of tax on tax. So the whole idea was that you need to actually take this into account, that this is something which is not rational. It introduces distortions because you have this cascading effect. Now, when this point is made about the cascading effect, while it is true that this is an issue which possibly needs to be thought about and addressed, we must recognize the fact that if you get rid of the tax cascading effect, it's not that you're going to pay less taxes. Because one of the issues under debate today you would have seen and recognized is that the government wants to get at the minimum to what is considered to be a revenue-neutral tax. That is, even when you shift from the current regime of sales taxes and excise duties to the value-added tax, the total amount of tax revenues which you're going to get, which you want to share between the states and the center, has at the minimum to be the same amount that you would have paid earlier, because you need a tax which doesn't reduce the revenue. In fact, the whole system now is that for the first 5 years of this regime, the central government has guaranteed the states that based on estimations of how much tax they would have got over the next 5 years, given the way incomes would move, the minimum they would get is that they would get at least that much tax revenue. So you're not merely in search, and it's a search because you don't know where it lies. You're not merely in search of a revenue neutral tax, which means that you get the same amount of revenues as you got under the previous regime, but you're actually looking for a system in which, in case you don't get that much, there has to be some way in which the central government has to find mechanisms by which it would compensate the states such that they get at least as much tax as they are getting currently. Now this would mean that therefore we shouldn't misunderstand this discussion about the fact that we're trying to get rid of the cascading effect and of the tax on tax in order to reduce the tax burden on people. That's not what is happening. All you're trying to say is that this is distortionary. You try and actually tax such that you don't repeat a tax on tax or repeat taxes on the same commodity because of the fact that it enters as an input or an intermediate. But you have to find ways of distributing your taxes on all commodities after allowing for the fact that you won't do this, such that at the minimum you get the same level of tax. Okay? So the point is, really what you're talking about then is not some kind of a tax regime which is going to be less burdensome. It's going to have the same degree at the minimum, but you're really looking for a tax regime which you think is non-distortionary. The second feature, which is seen as actually positive from the point of view of this tax, is that if you impose a value-added tax, in essence, you're operating under the principle that if you impose a value-added tax, that you would be operating in a framework in which you would be reducing, evasion or avoidance. That is, compliance would increase to a far greater degree. Why is that so? Because the way the value-added tax is implemented is not that you actually go at each stage, you take the value of a product, you take the value of its inputs, you subtract the value of its inputs from the output, and then you impose a tax on the difference. That's not what you do in practice. The way you impose a value-added tax is you impose a tax on the price of the commodity, whether it's an intermediate, whether it's a basic good, whether it's a final product, you impose a tax on the commodity. But you tell the person who's paying that tax, which is the firm, of course finally it's passed on to the consumer because it's an indirect tax, but you tell that firm or that economic agent that, listen, if you would bring to me a piece of paper which is validated, which tells me that you spent so much buying the inputs to produce this commodity, and when you spent so much to buy these inputs, because there was a tax on those inputs, you paid so much as tax. Against the tax you pay at, let us say, the 10% which is imposed on the commodity which you would get an offset. That is, whatever tax you paid on the input, you can actually reduce from the tax that you're expected to pay at the going rate of tax on the commodity that you have produced. So the way you implement the tax, which makes it easier to implement, is not that you make a calculation of value added or the difference between the price of the output of a commodity and the price of its inputs. You basically say, you pay on the price of the output of the commodity, but you don't have to pay in full to the extent that you can provide proof that when you bought this commodity, the person you bought it from has already paid a tax on the previous stage, or the previous stage before that, etc. So that's how it becomes a value-added tax. Now therefore, it does two things. One, of course, it actually makes it a requirement, if you want to get the benefit of this tax regime, that you should be able to provide the proof to say that the person you bought the commodity, the input from, has actually paid the tax which is due at that stage. If you can't prove that, then you don't get the benefit of this. Secondly, of course, what you're essentially saying is, if you can do that, if each person begins to ask the input supplier, please give me a receipt showing that you paid tax to the government at your stage because I needed to get my set off, it would be true that that person would be forced to go and pay the tax to the government and produce that certificate. So therefore, it is argued that there would be an increase in compliance because people whom you're selling to, accepting at the final stage, people who you're selling to will be forced to provide evidence to you as a buyer that they have paid tax, and therefore more and more people will come into the tax net. So really, the advantage of this tax does not lie in the fact that it reduces the burden of taxation, but it lies in one, the idea that you're going to get rid of this kind of irrationality where there is inputs are taxed multiple times and there's a tax on tax, and secondly, that it's likely to increase the degree of compliance as far as indirect taxation is concerned, because people at later stages will demand of people at earlier stages that they produce evidence that they pay taxes, because otherwise they won't get the set out. Okay? So therefore, the argument is two things would happen. First, of course, is that it becomes possible for the government to mobilize larger revenues, even if it's not able to find the appropriate rate of taxation to do that. Just compliance itself could increase tax revenues because of the fact that compliance would increase. And of course, it's seen as more efficient because of the fact that you're not doing this multiple taxation. Ostensibly, this is going to result in a situation in which more surpluses will be generated in the system because the ease of doing business increases, and this would supposedly result, it is argued, in this increase in what about the 1 percentage point in the rate of growth, 1.5 percentage point in the rate of growth, depending upon who's talking about it and what kind of a model they're using. Now, the fact of the matter is, we know these kind of models are not robust. Whether this happens or not, it didn't happen in Ghana, people claim it happened in Canada, but whether it happens or not, we know only when you actually go and implement the tax. But at the moment, the puzzle is not really whether all this would happen, that of course is the claim, but really the puzzle is, what is the rate of tax which I need to impose on different commodities such that I will get at least the same amount of tax revenue as I would have got under the existing tax regime. Now this is also significant, you must realize, this is also significant because if you're really saying that I want to get at least this rate of taxation which is the same as this tax regime, then it has an implication for this inequality in the tax burden, because one of the benefits which are supposed to come from a value-added tax, in our case it's not a value-added tax but GST, is that the benefit which you get is that the number of slabs which you'll have to impose is much less. That is, let's say you will have one slab which is for the really essential commodities or the exemptions for some commodities. You'll have a second slab which is not so essential, but it's still something which is consumed by people, let us say, in the middle classes. You'll have a third which is consumed by the upper middle class maybe, and maybe a fourth which is consumed by the really rich. Some 40%, let us say, is the sort of value-added tax you can think of, tax rate that you can think of in luxuries like whatever Mercedes-Benz cars and 6-door fridges and all sorts of fancy televisions and so on. You can think of all sorts of things on which you can impose a 40% value-added tax maybe. But the point is, one of the benefits of this tax is presented as that you're going to reduce the number of slabs. Now, if you're going to reduce the number of slabs, the degree to which you can differentiate between commodities, varying from something like salt, which everybody needs, to something like whatever, a BMW car, which very few people can afford, forget who needs, that you really end up with a situation where you need multiple rates of taxation for progressivity to be applied because of the fact that you have this kind of a very, very varied distribution of income along the vertical hierarchy. So if you can't have multiple taxes because the benefit of the tax is that implementing it to get you what's called ease of doing business is the number of tax slabs comes down, then obviously even to the extent that you can use this instrument in a progressive manner, the degree to which you can get progressivity is limited because one of the benefits you're going to exploit is the fact that you're not going to have too many slabs. Okay? So therefore, even if you take the value-added tax per se, not the GST, this is a more complicated phenomenon, even if you take the value-added tax per se, then you're really talking about a tax in which there are a lot of problems associated with getting the two benefits it provides, dealing with the cascading effect, and of course, making it ostensibly something which will ensure a higher degree of compliance because of the fact that you'll be forcing people to report the degree to which they are selling to others who use them as inputs or intermediates. Okay? Now the question is, okay, when we talk about this tax, and you read the newspapers, even today's newspapers, yesterday's newspaper, one thing you'll see is, oh, we've made the transition. It's one nation, one tax. Part of the statement is that listen, we've had all this messy taxation, states as excise duties, octroi on lorries which enter across the border, excise duties from the center, something else, etc., all sorts of duties we have. All that is going to go because they're all going to get integrated into this value-added tax structure, which says one nation, one tax. Now, if there is something which is completely absurd and wrong, it is that there cannot be, even under this GST, one nation, one tax. As I told you, you're going to have every state government passing a legislation which would actually establish its own version of the GST, because we're going to have a state level GST in which each state has a certain degree of flexibility and leeway. We are going to have a central level GST, which is a second parallel tax regime. We are going to have an IGST, which is the interstate GST, where if a product is produced in one state and sold in another state, the tax would be imposed by the center. And the moment the bill was passed in the Rajya Sabha, two state governments, West Bengal, Amit Mitra from West Bengal and Thomas Isaac from Kerala, said that listen, you haven't made clear that we have come to an agreement about the distribution of the revenues which will come from IGST. Already, the states are beginning to fight with each other. So you're really talking about the fact that you have all of this, plus some crucial commodities in which a lot of the tax revenue is generated either by the center or by the states, petroleum and petroleum products, alcohol, cigarettes. All of these are being kept out because these are important ways in which people do mobilize. We know that when oil prices went down, what the central government was doing under Mr. Jaitley was really continuously imposing new taxes on oils because people are not going to realize it so much. Because the price of oil has come down, if I increase the tax on it, the price of which I pay when I go to the bunk to fill up my tank is not going to be that much higher, or that it's at least going to be slightly lower. But meanwhile, the government is taking a large part of the decline in prices, which has been huge, which has occurred over a period of time. So if you look at the share of these kinds of items in total indirect tax revenue, both at the central level and in the case of some states, and Nitish has decided he doesn't want any taxation from alcohol, but some, there are things that they need a lot of taxation from alcohol because it's very important from their point of view. But if you take that away, it is a problem for many states because of the fact that that constitutes an important part of the revenue. Which means that you actually say that, listen, this is a federal polity, this is messy, this is not one nation. This is it's a nation which consists of many states. Some people used to call it, a multinational state, And therefore, these states want, as part of the federal, contract, the social contract on federalism, which we entered to in 1947 later, the states wants a certain degree of flexibility in terms of trying to impose taxes in order to meet the commitments it's supposed to meet as part of the division, which the union list, the state list, the combined list, the commitments it has to meet in many areas. And of course, it wants to fight with the center in terms of getting a larger share of devolved taxes because it's stuck with a lot of responsibilities to spend. And when people protest, they don't all travel to Delhi. They go to the state capital and protest if they actually face to the situation where some expenditure, some service, etc. are not being met. So therefore, we have a really messy tax structure even after this comes out because we got a state level GST, we got a central level GST, we got the IGST, then we got a set of commodities which have been kept out of this whole structure, which will have the same excise duties, sales taxes, etc. Now, the point is, okay, fine, you have all of this, but you can say that, but that's okay because you agree that there's going to be a central council. There's going to be a council which will consist of the finance minister or one other minister from each state government. It will consist of the finance minister here and a couple of other representatives. It has a weighted voting structure such that the states have a higher vote. And the role of this council is really to try and homogenize the tax structure. That is, if there's a particular commodity which is being taxed at a certain rate in one state, You would like it to be a situation to get the benefits of this value-added tax, which is the perfect thing you're trying to get. You would like to get a situation in which this tax applied on the same commodity in all of these states is the same. So the idea is that the GST Council would try and homogenize tax rates across the country. Well, this is an experiment, but the law does not require a state to actually go along with that. It doesn't require. A state can actually pass a law for its own state level GST in which it says no, I want to impose a different tax. If somebody is taxing something at 20%, I want to impose a 30% tax. Somebody is having 12%, I want an 18% tax. You still have to give the states the right to do this, because otherwise you wouldn't have got this consensus, this ostensible consensus. The consensus actually gives you this one additional benefit. That is that you have the right to deviate from the guidelines for homogenization which the National Council sets. Now what does this mean? See, the fundamental issue is, if you look at countries which implemented the VAT, there are two features about these countries. The first, of course, most of them implemented them under the aegis of either the USAID, the United States Agency for International Development. The most famous being, it was recommended then, was implemented only in the 1980s. The Shute Commission, which went to Japan when Japan was under American occupation, and tried to recommend in the period after the Second World War that they should implement the equivalent of a value-added tax. The Shute Commission's recommendation was not implemented immediately at that point of time, but subsequently in the 1980s, when the Japanese state decided that it didn't want to go in for additional direct taxation, they took this out of the books and actually implemented a value-added tax. So let's say you had about 3 stages in this. First, of course, you had, first country was France in 1954, which tried to implement some version of this for manufactured products for all sorts of reasons. Then you had a set of countries in Europe which began to think of this. That was part of the debate of creating a single common market. The idea was, if you wanted to create a single common market, you needed to have a homogenized tax, and the best way to have a good homogenized tax is to go in for some version of value-added tax. Then you had a large number of countries which, under the advice of the USAID or under the aegis of the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department, implemented this tax, including a large number of developing countries which were taking loans from the IMF or from the USA. And then, of course, you had some countries like Canada, Australia, etc., which chose to implement it for one reason or the other. So overall, if you look at it, a majority of the countries, particularly in the period after mid-1980s, which implemented VAT because of recommendations which came from what was part of a structural adjustment and stabilization strategy, a neoliberal economic strategy. So this is not a value, this is, at least in historical experience, this is not value neutral. It didn't come from anywhere, and we know this is not, because one country which also has a strong federal structure, which is the United States of America, while it has been walking around recommending this to other countries to implement, does not implement it itself. It doesn't, because of the fact that if you happen to be a federal country, it becomes so messy, the states are unlikely to accept unless you give them all sorts of concessions. And if you start giving them those concessions, you're not even implementing what you think is the tax you're trying to implement, which is this highly, ostensibly efficient value-added tax. So what we really have, therefore, is the adoption of a messy tax with questionable antecedents in terms of its ideological base, which is not going to give you this highly efficient one nation, one tax. This is all hype. And you're ending up with a situation where entering this experiment where nobody knows what is going to be the result of this. In fact, 2 lawyers have today written a piece in the Indian Express in which they even argue that, listen, this is going to result in a situation where imports are going to be cheaper than domestic products, because the structure of this taxation is such that there will be less burden on imported intermediates than there would be on intermediates produced domestically, so that you will be outcompeted by imports. So please hold on. When you introduced ModVAT in the mid-1980s, you first introduced it only for 37 commodities. So don't try and just implement it all of a sudden over the next 1 year. They want to implement the states to pass the laws and start on April 1st, 2017. And these 2 lawyers, they're not economists even, they're not particularly political, they basically say that, listen, if you look at it, you're actually getting into something in which you don't know all the effects are. So even though they're not against it, They're saying, please implement it step by step. Choose a few commodities, conduct an experiment, understand the problems, and then implement it in full. The final point I want to make is that not only do you have all this, in which finally you don't have what they claim. I mean, it's as if we've got this highly non-ideological, scientifically established, instrument, which is just going to change the history of post-liberalization India, post-liberalization India, because we've been waiting for so many years. I think it was Rangarajan who said, the problem is it should have been implemented something like 15 years back. But unfortunately, it's not, people don't listen to non-elected representatives, and elected representatives were not willing to accept its implementation 15 years back. It's a big thing that they've actually begun to accept it now, but as I said, it still has to go to the state level, and it is not that this is irreversible. Ghana had to pull back this tax because they couldn't sustain it, given the kind of opposition and dissidence which came after that. Because it not merely couldn't be implemented well, and that isn't a federal country like ours, but also it has inflationary effects which the populace was unwilling to accept. Because if you wanted to keep the same revenue, the kind of burden you had to impose on people was much higher, or at least certain sections of the population was much higher. But as I said, the last thing I want to say is, besides the social contract, which is implicit in our quasi-federal structure, which resulted in us creating this complicated tax structure, the finance commission, devolution of, what would be the percentage of tax revenues collected by the center, which will go to the state, which can you keep out, which you can't, etc. Which over a period of time, we must recognize, because of pressure from the states and because of the changed nature of Indian politics, where there are a lot of state governments which are not of the same political parties which rule in the center, we've had a shift which has occurred. We've had a shift in which the degree to which states are being able to get revenues out of this revenues collected by the center has increased in finance commission after finance commission, even though these finance commissions imposed all sorts of things on the state, like that they have to have FRBM Act, etc. But if you look at the devolution process has tried, at least at the finance commission level, not through the planning commission route, not through state spending directly, etc., but at least through the finance commission route, has tried to increase the extent of devolution. Now, the reason we needed all of this is not merely that we were a federal state, and quasi-federal state, and which entered into this contract after independence, but fundamentally this is a capitalist society, and a defining feature of capitalism is uneven development. It never happens in the history of capitalism, forget outside of capitalism, even there was a problem, but it has never happened in the history of capitalism that you have development which occurs across space, spatially, at the same pace and in the same fashion. What you actually have is, whether it is the imperialist countries and the underdeveloped countries, the developed regions within underdeveloped countries, and the less developed regions, the hill areas and the plains, etc., you actually have, when the market mechanism works itself out, you have a high degree of uneven development. Now, when you have uneven development, what does it mean? It means that the structure of economies at the level of states, districts, etc., let's say in this case what matters is the states, the structure of the economy, besides the level of per capita income and distribution of income, is very different. When you go to a Bihar, you go to a Goa, you go to a Kerala, you go to a West Bengal, you go to a Gujarat, you go to a Maharashtra, you go to Tamil Nadu, it's very different. Now, if you have different structures, different per capita incomes, different distributions of income, what's called the taxation capacity of that state varies. The degree to which you can mobilize taxes varies. So that actually accentuates the tendency towards uneven development, because the more developed states have a greater degree of taxable capacity, they can generate more revenues, they can spend more, they can build more infrastructure, and therefore this uneven development only increases over a period of time. So therefore, what happens? It basically means that if you happen to be a state which is less developed, what you want to try and do is to try and ensure that there is a divisible pool of taxes, of which to take care of your backwardness, you get a higher share. That is, there is not merely a division between the center and the states, which the Finance Commission looks at, it looks at a division between states as well. And part of what you're trying to look at when you're looking at the division between states is to see the degree to which, within the principles you adopt, you're able to address the problem of uneven development. And the second thing which happens is, you actually have the right to have a tax structure which is different from somebody else. Because if you say I'm going to put most of my tax on manufactured goods, let's say the state I come from, the state of Kerala, I mean, hardly has any manufacturing, It's not going to get any tax revenues. So you basically can say that, okay, this is a goods and services tax, it's good for it. But in a larger sense, what you would expect is the way in which you'd like to devise your tax structure would be dependent upon the structure you have, the per capita income you're characterized by, and the distribution of income that you've sort of acquired over time in history. Now, if that be the case, it is inherently, fundamentally wrong to say that in a context of uneven development, you can have a homogenized tax structure. That's completely wrong. You cannot have a homogenized tax structure, because if you have a homogenized tax structure, either the developed states would lose or the less developed states would lose. Somebody will have to lose because of the fact that tax structures have to be different for you to get the maximum, given the fact of your economic structure, your per capita income, and the distribution of income. So, in a federal polity, in a context in which you're a capitalist society which is characterized by a high degree of uneven development, which then tends to get accentuated over a period of time, to have this vision, not merely of one nation, one tax, but to have a vision that we'll have a homogenized tax structure, obviously means that, I mean, you're not thinking, forget whether, you've studied what the IMF has written on the value-added tax, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. You're not implementing the tax, even that tax is the best in the world, which it isn't. But even if it was, you're not going to be able to implement this. So therefore, the only way you can see this is the fact that the elite consensus is not a consensus on VAT, on GST, or anything of that kind. The elite consensus is on two things. The elite consensus is you have to move away from direct taxation to indirect taxation, and have a form of indirect taxation which you can implement, even if that implies that you're going to have a regressive burden in terms of the way in which the tax is imposed on different sections of the people. So you want to move away from direct to indirect, and you want to get a lot of money out of indirect taxation, and you want to get it, therefore, to a mechanism which is bound to be inherently regressive. The second element of the elite consensus is that it is a consensus in which you're basically saying that we need to find ways in which the neoliberal project is advanced, and the neoliberal project has to be advanced in a way in which you're not going to touch capital, you want to touch it somewhere else, and therefore it's fine to go in for a GST, because you're actually bringing in something which is part of a neoliberal frame, which is designed as part of IMF kind of stabilization and structural adjustment strategies, which was pushed by the USAID, which couldn't push it in its own country, and you then want to push it into new countries. But now it's not because we're being pushed, it's because of the fact that the elite consensus is within. You actually have an elite which is willing to take this on and put it in the books, not because it has understood what it is doing, but because of the fact that if it affects anybody adversely, the people it's going to affect are not those who belong to that kind of a discourse which establishes this kind of an elite consensus in which this tax has become something which you have to accept. Because listen, I mean, there's no question that this is the best tax we have. It's just that because of messy politics, we can't implement it. What's going to actually assert itself is not the messy politics, but the messy economics, which leads to the support of taxation of this kind of thing.